Stock options canceled. Celeste Warwick's voice echoed through the boardroom like a death sentence. Her perfectly manicured fingers slid the termination document across the mahogany table toward me, a smile playing at the corners of her blood-red lips. Every single share. Voided. You'll walk away with nothing but your pathetic severance package. The room felt like it was spinning. 7 years of my life. 7 years of 80-hour weeks, missed birthdays, sacrificed relationships, all for those stock options that were supposed to be my financial freedom. Genesis Biopharmaceuticals had just gone public 3 months ago, and my vested options were worth $2.3 million. My escape plan, my future. I looked down at the document, my hands trembling. But not from fear, from rage so pure it felt like ice in my veins. That's when I smiled. Bylaw 24 billion, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The non-disclosure trap your mother signed when she transitioned you into the chairman role. Celeste's smile faltered. Just for a second, but I caught it. Voiding my stock automatically voids your chairman immunity clause. They're waiting for your resignation at the boardroom door. The color drained from her face. Welcome to the Payback Office channel, where karma doesn't just catch up, it runs a marathon in stilettos and crosses the finish line with a smile. If you're joining us for the first time, or if you've been here watching justice unfold, consider hitting that subscribe button. We're on our way to reaching 7,000 subscribers, and having you as part of this community means everything. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. My name is Sienna Rhodes, and until 3 hours ago, I was the Senior Director of Clinical Operations at Genesis Biopharmaceuticals. My grandmother raised me in a small apartment in Detroit after my parents died in a car accident when I was 6. She cleaned offices at night and worked as a seamstress during the day, but she never let our circumstances define our worth. She taught me that understanding where you come from doesn't mean staying there. It means remembering the people who helped you climb while you're on your way up. That empathy, that connection to struggle, became my superpower in a corporate world that often mistakes cruelty for strength. Genesis wasn't always the cold, calculating machine it became under Celeste's leadership. When I joined 7 years ago, it was still run by her mother, Vivian Warwick, a brilliant scientist who'd built the company from a 2-person startup in her garage to a biotech powerhouse with over 3,000 employees. Vivian believed in profit, sure, but she also believed in purpose. Our mission was to develop affordable treatments for rare diseases that Big Pharma ignored because the profit margins weren't attractive enough. I started as a clinical trials coordinator, managing patient recruitment and data collection for our flagship drug, Genesis -7, a treatment for a rare pediatric kidney disorder. The pay was decent, but what kept me there were the stock options, generous grants that vested over 4 years. Vivian made sure every employee, from the janitors to the C-suite, had skin in the game. "We build this together, we profit together," she'd say at company meetings, her eyes bright with genuine conviction. I threw myself into the work. I coordinated 17 clinical trials in 5 years, always coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. I built relationships with patient advocacy groups, smoothed over regulatory hurdles with the FDA, and trained a team of coordinators who became some of the most respected professionals in the industry. My dedication didn't go unnoticed. 3 years ago, Vivian promoted me to Senior Director of Clinical Operations, overseeing all late-stage trials across the company's pipeline. The promotion came with a significant salary bump and, more importantly, a massive stock option grant. 150,000 shares at a strike price of $2.50 per share. At the time, Genesis was still private, valued at maybe $500 million. But we had 3 drugs approaching FDA approval, and the smart money said we were looking at an IPO within 2 years. If things went well, those options could be worth millions. They went better than well. Genesis -7 won FDA approval 18 months ago. Our second drug, a treatment for a rare blood disorder, followed 6 months later. Suddenly, we weren't just a promising startup. We were a validated biotech company with actual revenue and a clear path to profitability. That's when Celeste came back. Vivian's daughter had spent the previous decade bouncing between investment banks in New York, building a reputation as a ruthless dealmaker who'd sell her own grandmother if the EBITDA multiple was attractive enough. She'd had minimal involvement with Genesis, showing up for board meetings maybe twice a year, always dressed like she was heading to a fashion show rather than a biotech company. But when she smelled the IPO money, she came running home. Vivian was 68 and starting to show signs of fatigue. The board had been quietly pressuring her to name a successor, and despite my hopes that she'd promote one of the executives who'd actually built the company, she chose blood over merit. Celeste became CEO 6 months before the IPO. The change was immediate and brutal. Within weeks, she'd fired or forced out half the executive team, replacing them with finance bros from her New York network who knew nothing about drug development but everything about squeezing margins. The company's mission statement was revised, removing all language about affordable treatments and social responsibility. Now it was all about maximizing shareholder value and optimizing resource allocation. In plain English, profit over patience. I kept my head down and focused on my trials. I had less than a year until my big option grant fully vested, and then I could cash out and leave. Maybe start a consulting firm, help smaller biotech companies navigate the clinical development process. I'd been squirreling away the details of my most successful trials, building a portfolio that would make me attractive to future clients. Celeste noticed my detachment. She wanted loyalty, not competence. She wanted people who'd applaud her brilliance and execute her vision without question. I was neither. The first warning shot came 4 months ago. I was in a pipeline review meeting, presenting the Phase 3 results for Genesis-12, our treatment for a rare neurological disorder affecting children. The data was exceptional. The drug met all primary and secondary endpoints with minimal side effects. It was exactly the kind of breakthrough that had made Genesis special. Recommended next steps, I concluded, are to file for FDA approval and begin planning for commercial launch. Based on the patient population and our pricing analysis, we're looking at peak annual revenues of approximately $200 million. Celeste stared at me from across the conference table, her expression unreadable. $200 million, she repeated flatly, for a drug that took us 6 years and $300 million to develop. That's correct, I said, confused by her tone. It's a rare disease. The patient population is only about 8,000 in the US, but this could be life-changing for— Terminate the program, she interrupted. Silence filled the room. I'm sorry, I managed. Genesis-12 doesn't meet our new investment hurdles. We require a minimum of 3x return on development costs within 5 years of launch. This drug doesn't clear that bar. Terminate it and reallocate the resources to Genesis-19. Genesis-19 was a cosmetic treatment for hair loss, a massive potential market, sure, but hardly the life-saving medicine Genesis had built its reputation on. Celeste, with respect, we have children in the compassionate use program who are depending on this drug. We've made commitments to the patient community. We can and we will. Her voice was ice. This is a business, Sienna, not a charity. If you can't understand that, perhaps you're not the right fit for the leadership team going forward. The threat hung in the air. I bit back the dozen responses burning in my throat and nodded stiffly. Understood, but I didn't understand. I didn't understand how someone could look at dying children and see nothing but an inadequate return on investment. I didn't understand how Vivian's daughter had turned into this. That night, I drafted my resignation letter. I'd survive for another 8 months until my options vested, then I'd walk away from this place and never look back. Except fate had other plans. 2 weeks later, Vivian Warwick died of a stroke. She was gone before the ambulance arrived, her brilliant mind silenced in an instant. The funeral was a spectacle. Celeste made sure of that. She wore a vintage Chanel suit and gave a eulogy that would have won an Oscar, talking about her mother's vision and legacy while carefully positioning herself as the chosen heir to that vision. I stood in the back of the church, watching this performance, and felt something shift inside me. Vivian deserved better than this. The company deserved better. The patients deserved better. But I still needed those options to vest, so I waited. Celeste consolidated power quickly after Vivian's death. The board, packed with investors who cared only about the upcoming IPO, gave her whatever she wanted. She restructured the company, eliminating entire departments and outsourcing critical functions to contractors. Morale collapsed. People started leaving in droves, good people, talented people who'd built Genesis alongside Vivian. I stayed. 8 months became 6. 6 became 3. The IPO finally happened on a crisp October morning. Genesis Biopharmaceuticals started trading at $42 per share and closed the day at $58. My options, with a strike price of $2.50, were suddenly worth over $8 million on paper. But I couldn't exercise them until they vested, and I couldn't sell them until 90 days after the IPO per the company's lockup agreement. I just had to survive 3 more months. That's when Celeste started her campaign to force me out. It began subtly. My invitations to key meetings mysteriously disappeared. Projects I'd led for years were reassigned to her New York cronies without explanation. My team was scattered across other departments, and my budget was slashed by 60%. I documented everything. Every slight, every reassignment, every conversation. My grandmother had taught me to trust my instincts, and my Instonauts were screaming that Celeste was building a case to fire me before my options vested. 2 months before vesting, she made her move. I was called into a meeting with Celeste and Hamilton Price, the new chief operating officer she'd brought in from her investment banking days. Hamilton was everything I despised about corporate climbers: slick, soulless, and completely convinced of his own brilliance despite having never developed a drug or run a clinical trial in his life. "Sienna, we need to discuss your performance," Celeste began, sliding a document across the table. "We've been tracking several concerning metrics in your department." I picked up the document. It was a performance improvement plan, a PIP, the corporate kiss of death. 30 days to meet impossible targets or face termination. "These metrics," I said slowly, scanning the page, "are for projects I haven't managed in 4 months. Projects that were reassigned to Hamilton's team." "Exactly," Hamilton jumped in, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We've had to clean up several messes you left behind. Timelines missed, budgets exceeded, quality issues. It's really quite concerning." It was a lie, every word. I knew it, they knew it, and they knew I knew it. "I'd like to review the specific data supporting these claims," I said calmly. "Project files, budget reports, timeline documents. I'm sure there's been some kind of miscommunication." Celeste's smile was razor-sharp. "Of course, we'll have Hamilton's team compile everything and send it over. In the meantime, we need you to sign this PIP acknowledging the issues and committing to the improvement plan. I'll need to have my attorney review this first." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "That seems unnecessary," Celeste said, her voice dangerously soft. "Unless you're planning to be difficult about this." "I'm planning to be thorough," I replied, meeting her gaze without blinking. "I've dedicated 7 years to this company. If my performance is suddenly in question, I want to understand exactly what changed and why." I didn't sign the PIP. Instead, I hired Catherine Wu, one of the best employment attorneys in Boston, and prepared for war. Catherine was brilliant. Within a week, she'd sent a detailed response to the PIP, systematically dismantling every claim with documentation I'd kept over the years. She also filed a formal complaint with HR about the hostile work environment and included a pointed reference to the suspicious timing of the PIP relative to my option vesting date. Celeste backed off. The PIP was quietly withdrawn, and I was left alone to finish out my time. 1 month before vesting, I started planning my exit. I updated my resume, reached out to my network, and scheduled meetings with headhunters. I was done with Genesis. The day my options vested, I'd exercise them, survive the 90-day lockup period, sell the shares, and walk away with enough money to never have to work for someone like Celeste again. I should have known it wouldn't be that easy. 3 days before my vesting date, I received a calendar invitation for a strategic planning session with Celeste. No agenda, no other attendees listed. Just the 2 of us and a conference room. I almost didn't go. Every instinct told me it was a trap. But I was so close to the finish line, and I couldn't risk giving her any excuse to claim I was being insubordinate. I arrived at the boardroom exactly on time. Celeste was already there, sitting at the head of the table like a queen on her throne. In front of her was a single folder. "Sienna, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Please sit. I sat, keeping my expression neutral. I'll get right to the point, Celeste continued, flipping open the folder. We've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately. My heart stopped. On what grounds? Violation of your employment agreement. Specifically, the non-compete and confidentiality clauses. She slid a document across the table. It was a printout of an email I'd sent to a former colleague, now a VP at a competing biotech company, 3 weeks ago. The email was innocuous, just industry gossip and an update on my job search, but Celeste had highlighted one sentence in yellow. The clinical data from our recent trials has been exceptionally strong, particularly in the rare disease space. This, Celeste said, tapping the highlighted sentence with one manicured nail, constitutes disclosure of confidential company information to a competitor. It's a clear violation of your employment agreement. I stared at her in disbelief. That's public information. We issued a press release about those trial results 2 months ago. The press release discussed top-line data. Your email implies access to detailed clinical information that hasn't been publicly disclosed. It doesn't imply anything. I was making small talk with a colleague. That's your interpretation. Our legal team disagrees. She slid another document across the table. This is your termination letter. Per Section 7.3 of your employment agreement, termination for cause results in immediate forfeiture of all unvested equity compensation. And there it was. The real reason for this charade. My stock options, 150,000 shares that would be worth over $8 million, gone with the stroke of a pen. You can't do this, I said, hating how my voice shook. This is completely fabricated. You're just trying to steal my options before they vest. Stock options canceled. Celeste's voice suddenly rose, sharp and triumphant. She was enjoying this, feeding off my distress like a vampire. Every single share, voided, you'll walk away with nothing but your pathetic severance package. The room spun. 7 years. 7 years of my life, traded for nothing because this monster wanted to save the company $8 million. But then something clicked in my brain. A memory from 18 months ago, during the leadership transition when Celeste took over as CEO. There had been a special board meeting to revise the corporate bylaws, updating them to reflect the new leadership structure and prepare for the IPO. I'd been asked to take notes at that meeting since the regular corporate secretary was out on medical leave. I'd sat in the corner with my laptop, dutifully recording every discussion, every vote, every amendment to the company's governing documents. And I remembered one bylaw in particular. Bylaw 24 billion. It had been proposed by Vivian's attorney, a crusty old corporate lawyer named Arthur Blackwood who'd been with the company since its founding. The bylaw was designed to protect employee equity compensation from exactly this kind of executive overreach. The language was complex, buried in legal jargon, but the intent was clear. Any executive with chairman-level authority who unilaterally voided employee stock options for reasons other than criminal conduct would automatically trigger a review of their own compensation and authority. More importantly, it would void certain immunity clauses that protected executives from shareholder lawsuits. It was Vivian's insurance policy, her way of making sure that whoever succeeded her couldn't gut the employee equity program she'd built. And Celeste had no idea it existed. Vivian had signed the updated bylaws in one of her last acts as chairman, just days before her stroke. Celeste had been too busy planning the IPO roadshow to pay attention to the minutiae of corporate governance. She'd inherited the chairman title, along with all the rights and responsibilities encoded in those bylaws, including Bylaw 24 billion. I felt a smile forming on my lips, cold and calculating. Something funny? Celeste snapped, clearly irritated that I wasn't begging or crying. Bylaw 24 billion, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. Her expression flickered, confusion, then concern. What? The non-disclosure trap your mother signed when she transitioned you into the chairman role. I leaned back in my chair, watching the color start to drain from her face. Voiding my stock automatically voids your chairman immunity clause. They're waiting for your resignation at the boardroom door. Celeste's eyes went wide. You're bluffing. Am I? I pulled out my phone and opened my email. I took the liberty of reaching out to Arthur Blackwood this morning when I received your mysterious meeting invitation. You remember Arthur, your mother's attorney, the one who drafted the bylaw amendments 18 months ago? I turned my phone so she could see the email thread. Arthur had responded within an hour, clearly relishing the opportunity to explain the legal trap Vivian had set. According to Arthur, I continued, Bylaw 24 billion was specifically designed to prevent exactly what you're trying to do. Any unilateral cancellation of vested or near-vested employee equity triggers an automatic board review. During that review, the chairman's immunity from shareholder derivative suits is suspended. I watched the implications sink in. Genesis had gone public at $42 and closed yesterday at $61 per share. Shareholders were happy, for now, but there were already rumblings of discontent about Celeste's management style, the exodus of experienced employees, the shift away from the mission-driven culture Vivian had built. If those shareholders suddenly had legal standing to sue Celeste personally for mismanagement, for the controversial decisions she'd made, for the value destruction her leadership had caused beneath the surface of the rising stock price. You wouldn't, Celeste whispered. I wouldn't have to, I replied. Arthur is required by law to report bylaw violations to the board. I forwarded him your termination letter an hour ago. He was scheduled to brief the independent directors at 3 o'clock. I glanced at my watch. It was 3:47 p.m. Right on cue, Celeste's phone buzzed, then again, and again. She looked down at the screen, and I watched her face transform from confident triumph to ashen horror. The board is convening an emergency meeting, I said conversationally. I believe they'd like to discuss your decision to void my equity compensation, among other concerns that have been raised about your leadership. Arthur mentioned something about fiduciary duty violations and potential securities fraud, but I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding. Celeste's hands were shaking now. You can't. I'm the CEO, I'm the chairman. They can't just. Actually, per Bylaw 24 billion, they can. I stood up, gathering my things. The immunity clause that's now void was the only thing protecting you from personal liability for some of your more creative decisions. The Genesis Minus 12 termination, for example. Did you know the patient advocacy groups filed a formal complaint with the SEC about that? They alleged that you killed a promising drug program to artificially inflate short-term profitability metrics before the IPO. That was news to her. I could tell by the way her eyes went even wider. Without chairman immunity, you're personally exposed to any shareholder suits that emerge from that investigation. And Arthur tells me there are at least 6 other decisions in the past 8 months that could form the basis for derivative litigation. The board is probably calculating their exposure right now and deciding whether you're worth the liability. Celeste's phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and flinched. It was Walter Gaines, the lead independent director. She didn't answer. You should probably take that, I suggested. Though I imagine they'll want to have the conversation in person. The boardroom is just down the hall, after all. I walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Celeste was still frozen in her chair, staring at her phone as it continued to ring. You know what the saddest part is? I said. Your mother built something extraordinary. She created a company that made money and saved lives. She built a culture where people felt valued and invested in the mission. You could have continued that legacy. You could have been a leader worth following. I shook my head. But you saw dollar signs instead of human beings. You saw employees as cost centers instead of assets. And now you're going to lose everything because you were too greedy to let one person keep what they'd earned. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The executive floor was eerily quiet. Everyone was either in the emergency board meeting or had found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. As I walked toward the elevator, I passed the boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see Walter Gaines and the other independent directors gathered around the table, their expressions grave. Arthur Blackwood was there too, a thick binder of documents in front of him. Walter saw me and gave a small nod. I nodded back. The elevator arrived, and I stepped inside. As the doors closed, I saw Celeste emerge from the conference room, her face pale, her confident stride replaced by uncertain steps toward the boardroom where her reckoning waited. I should have felt triumphant. I just deployed a corporate nuclear weapon and watched it detonate in real time. But mostly, I just felt tired. The truth is, Bylaw 24 billion was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. It didn't automatically remove Celeste from power. It just exposed her to accountability she thought she was immune from. What happened next would depend on the board, on the shareholders, on whether the independent directors had the courage to stand up to her. But I'd done my part. I'd pulled the thread that would unravel her empire of cruelty. Catherine Wu was waiting in the lobby when I exited the elevator. I'd texted her from the boardroom, giving her a heads up about what was unfolding. "How do you feel?" she asked as we walked toward the parking garage. "Ask me when I know if it worked," I replied. "Oh, it worked," Catherine grinned. "I just got off the phone with Arthur. The board is voting on whether to request Celeste's immediate resignation. Walter Gaines is apparently pushing hard for it. Turns out he was one of Vivian's oldest friends and has been looking for an excuse to remove Celeste since the IPO." I stopped walking. They're actually going to fire her? Probably not fire. More like offer her a choice: resign gracefully with a modest severance, or be terminated for cause and face the shareholder lawsuits without any company support. Catherine's smile widened. Either way, she's done. And Walter made it clear that any resolution involves protecting your equity compensation. Apparently, he's been furious about the way Celeste has been treating the old guard employees. The weight I'd been carrying for months suddenly lifted. My options were safe. More than that, I'd protected myself and possibly saved Genesis from further destruction under Celeste's leadership. "There's more," Catherine added. "Walter wants to meet with you tomorrow. Off the record, he mentioned that the board is looking for an interim COO while they search for a new CEO. Someone who understands the company's original mission and has the operational expertise to steady the ship." I stared at her. "He wants to offer me the COO position? He wants to talk to you about it. No guarantees, but I think you'd be in a strong position to negotiate." My phone buzzed, an email from the Genesis board secretary. "All equity compensation actions taken in the past 72 hours have been reversed pending board review of executive authority protocols. Your stock option vesting schedule remains on track per your original grant agreement." I read the email twice, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. My options were safe. $8 million, still on track to vest in 3 days, and possibly a COO offer that would let me help restore Genesis to what Vivian had envisioned. The elevator dinged behind us, and I turned to see who was coming. It was Hamilton Price, Celeste's right-hand man, carrying a banker's box filled with personal items from his desk. His face was red, and he wouldn't make eye contact as he hurried past us toward the parking garage. Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Looks like the purge has begun." That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, still processing everything that had happened. My phone had been buzzing nonstop, colleagues texting congratulations mixed with confusion about what was happening at the executive level, recruiters who'd somehow already heard that I was available, and one unexpected call from Arthur Blackwood himself. Vivian would be proud, the old attorney had said, his voice warm with approval. She put that bylaw in place because she knew her daughter. She hoped Celeste would rise to the occasion, but she prepared for the possibility that she wouldn't. "You did exactly what Vivian intended. You used the tools she left behind to protect what she'd built." "I was just protecting my own equity," I'd replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "Maybe. But you also protected the company from someone who was destroying it from the inside. That takes courage." After we hung up, I pulled out an old photo I kept in my desk drawer. It was from my first day at Genesis, taken at a company picnic 7 years ago. Vivian was in the center of the frame, surrounded by employees, her face lit up with genuine joy. I was off to one side, barely visible, just another new hire in a crowd of faces. I wondered what Vivian would think of what I'd done. Would she see it as justice or betrayal? Her daughter was about to lose everything because I'd weaponized a corporate bylaw. But then I remembered Genesis-12, the drug Celeste had killed to boost short-term profitability. I thought about the families who'd been counting on that treatment, the children who would continue suffering because Celeste couldn't see past the next quarter's earnings report. No, I'd done the right thing. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Walter Gaines with a meeting invitation for 9 a.m. the next morning. Subject line: "The future of Genesis." I accepted the invitation and allowed myself a small smile. The next morning, I arrived at Genesis headquarters at 8:45 a.m. The building felt different, lighter somehow, as if a oppressive fog had lifted overnight. Employees who'd been walking around like zombies for months were chatting in the hallways, their voices cautiously optimistic. Walter Gaines met me in a small conference room on the executive floor, far from the boardroom where Celeste had tried to destroy my career less than 24 hours ago. "Sienna, thank you for coming." Walter was in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every corporate drama imaginable and was too old to be impressed by any of them. "I'll cut to the chase. Celeste resigned last night, effective immediately. The board has accepted her resignation and is beginning the search for a new CEO." I nodded, unsure what response was appropriate. "We need leadership stability while that search is underway," Walter continued. "The company is at a critical juncture. The IPO was successful, but we're facing significant operational challenges. Employee morale is in the toilet. We've lost key talent, our pipeline strategy is a mess, and frankly, the investment community is starting to ask questions about our direction." He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "I knew your grandmother, Sienna." That caught me off guard. "You? What?" "Dolores Rhodes. She worked as a seamstress for my wife's boutique in Detroit for years, made the most beautiful alterations, could take a $50 dress from a department store and make it look like haute couture." Walter smiled at the memory. "When I heard you'd joined Genesis, I looked into your background. Dolores used to talk about you all the time, how proud she was that you'd gotten your degree, that you were working in biotech. She passed away." "What, 4 years ago?" "5, I said quietly, my throat tight. "I'm sorry, she was a remarkable woman." Walter's expression turned serious again. "She'd be proud of what you did yesterday. Not the corporate maneuvering, though that was impressively executed, but the why behind it. You didn't do it just for the money. You did it because Celeste was destroying something worth preserving." I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. "The board wants to offer you the position of Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. We'll put together a competitive compensation package, including a significant equity grant. Your primary responsibility will be stabilizing operations while we search for a new CEO. That means rebuilding the leadership team, restoring the culture, and getting our clinical pipeline back on track." "What about the CEO search?" I asked. "Who are you looking for?" Walter's smile was knowing. "We're looking for someone who understands both the science and the business. Someone who's proven they can execute operationally while maintaining sight of the mission. Someone who has the respect of the employee base and the courage to stand up to the board when necessary." He paused. "We're looking for someone like you, Sienna, but we understand if you need time in the COO role first. Building a company isn't a sprint." The implication was clear. This was a trial run, prove myself as COO, and the CEO role could follow. "I'll need to bring in my own leadership team," I said, my mind already racing through the list of talented people who'd left Genesis over the past year. Some of the best people we had jumped ship when Celeste took over. "I want to bring them back." "Done, you'll have full authority over organizational structure and hiring. And Genesis-12, I want to restart that program." Walter nodded. "The board is already prepared to approve that. We've received preliminary interest from the FDA about an expedited review pathway, given the patient need. It'll be expensive, but it's the right thing to do." "Then I accept." We shook hands, and just like that, I went from nearly losing everything to becoming the chief operating officer of a publicly traded biotech company worth $3 billion. The news broke internally within an hour. My phone exploded with messages, some congratulatory, some cautiously optimistic, and a few that were clearly people trying to get back on my good side after months of avoiding me. I spent the rest of the day in back-to-back meetings with department heads, trying to assess the damage Celeste had done and prioritize what needed to be fixed first. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd expected. Entire clinical programs had been gutted. Key vendor relationships had been destroyed by Hamilton Price's aggressive cost-cutting. The company's reputation in the patient advocacy community was in shambles, but there were bright spots too. The science was still strong. The drugs in our late-stage pipeline were still viable. And most importantly, the employees who'd survived Celeste's purge were hungry for leadership they could believe in. By 7 p.m., I was exhausted but energized. I'd made 3 key hires already, all former Genesis employees who'd left during Celeste's reign of terror, and scheduled a town hall for the next day to address the entire company. As I was packing up to leave, there was a knock on my office door. It was Thomas Chen. Wait, I need to use a different name. It was Thomas Bailey, one of our senior scientists who'd been with the company since the early days. "Sorry to bother you," he said, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "I just wanted to say, thank you for what you did, for standing up to her." "I was just protecting my options," I deflected, uncomfortable with the praise. "No," Thomas shook his head firmly. "You stood up to a bully who was destroying everything Vivian built. Half the company wanted to do what you did, but we were too scared. You weren't." He left before I could respond, but his words stayed with me. Maybe I had been brave, or maybe I'd just been desperate enough to take a risk that happened to pay off. Either way, I was here now, and I had a responsibility to make the most of this opportunity. 3 days later, my stock options vested right on schedule. I exercised them immediately, paying $375,000 for shares worth over $8 million at current market prices. But I didn't sell. Not yet. If I was going to rebuild Genesis, I needed to have skin in the game. The employees needed to see that their new COO was invested in the company's long-term success, not just looking for a quick payout. The lockup period would expire in 67 days anyway. I could wait. The town hall was standing room only. I stood on the small stage in the cafeteria, looking out at hundreds of faces, some hopeful, some skeptical, all waiting to see if I was the real deal or just another executive who'd promise change and deliver more of the same. "I'm not going to pretend the past year hasn't been difficult," I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. "We've lost good people. We've lost sight of our mission. We've made decisions that prioritized short-term profits over the patients we're supposed to serve." I paused, letting that sink in. "But we're going to fix it. Starting today, Genesis is going back to its roots. We're going to develop drugs that matter, for patients who need them, even if the financial returns aren't blockbuster level. We're going to rebuild a culture where people feel valued and heard, and we're going to do it together." The applause started slowly, then built to something that felt like relief mixed with hope. Over the next few weeks, I worked 16-hour days rebuilding what Celeste had broken. I restarted the Genesis-12 program and personally called the patient advocacy groups to apologize for the way they'd been treated. I restructured the clinical operations team, promoting talented coordinators who'd been overlooked. I fired the worst of Celeste's cronies and brought back experienced leaders who understood the company's mission. The board gave me remarkable freedom to operate, trusting that I knew what needed to be done. Walter Gaines checked in regularly, offering advice when I asked for it, but otherwise staying out of my way. 2 months into my tenure as COO, we received FDA approval for Genesis-15, our treatment for the rare blood disorder. It was validation that the science was still strong, that we could still execute despite the organizational chaos of the past year. The stock price climbed to $73 per share. My options were now worth over $10 million. I finally sold half my position, using the proceeds to pay off my student loans, buy a modest house, and set up a charitable foundation in my grandmother's name to provide scholarships for kids from Detroit pursuing careers in STEM fields. The other half I held on to, because this wasn't over yet. 4 months after Celeste's resignation, the board officially offered me the CEO position. I accepted. The press release went out the next morning, and my phone immediately exploded with media requests. The narrative was too perfect for the business press to ignore. Young executive outsmarts ruthless boss, saves company, rises to the top. But the reality was more complex. I'd gotten lucky. Lucky that Vivian had put Bylaw 24 billion in place. Lucky that I'd been asked to take notes at that board meeting. Lucky that Arthur Blackwood was still around to explain the legal implications. And I'd been desperate. If my options had already vested, would I have taken the risk? Would I have stood up to Celeste if I didn't have millions of dollars on the line? I wanted to believe I would have, but I wasn't sure. What I was sure of was that I had a responsibility now. Not just to the shareholders or the board, but to the employees who'd stuck with Genesis through the worst of it, and to the patients who were counting on us to develop treatments nobody else would touch. My first major decision as CEO was to restructure our equity compensation program, making sure that every employee, from the janitors to the executive team, had meaningful stock options that would actually vest. I called it the Vivian Warwick Legacy Equity Plan, and it became a model that other biotech companies started copying. The second decision was to establish an independent ethics board with real authority to review major strategic decisions and ensure they aligned with the company's mission. No more killing promising drugs just to goose the quarterly numbers. Genesis's stock price didn't soar under my leadership the way it might have under someone more focused on short-term shareholder returns. But it steadily grew, and more importantly, so did our impact. We got 3 more drugs approved in my first 2 years as CEO, including Genesis-12, the rare pediatric kidney disease treatment that Celeste had tried to kill. I still remember the day we got that approval. We held a celebration at our headquarters and invited the patient families to attend. There was a 6-year-old girl named Emma who'd been in our compassionate use program. She'd been in a wheelchair when the program started. By the celebration, she was running around the cafeteria, full of energy, her kidneys functioning normally for the first time in her life. Her mother found me afterward, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my daughter's life," she said, gripping my hands. "The scientists saved her life," I deflected. "I just made sure the program didn't get canceled." "No," she shook her head firmly. "If you hadn't stood up when you did, Genesis-12 would be dead. Emma would still be deteriorating. You saved her." That night, alone in my office, I finally let myself cry. Not from sadness or stress, but from the overwhelming weight of gratitude and responsibility. This was why the fight with Celeste had mattered. Not for the money, not for the title, but for moments like this. The aftermath of Celeste's resignation was less dramatic than I expected. She landed on her feet, as people like her always do, taking a senior role at a private equity firm where her ruthless approach to cost-cutting was considered an asset rather than a liability. We never spoke again after that day in the boardroom. Hamilton Price and the rest of her inner circle scattered to other companies, their resumes conveniently glossing over their time at Genesis during the transition period. Walter Gaines served on the board for another 3 years before retiring, but he remained a mentor and friend. He told me once that watching me rebuild Genesis reminded him why he'd fallen in love with business in the first place. The possibility that companies could be a force for good in the world, not just wealth extraction machines. Arthur Blackwood passed away 18 months after I became CEO. At his funeral, his daughter told me that one of his proudest moments in his entire legal career was watching Bylaw 24 billion work exactly as Vivian had intended. "He called you a fighter," she said you reminded him of Vivian when she was young. I kept a photo of Vivian on my desk, right next to the one of my grandmother. 2 women who taught me that where you come from matters less than what you do with the opportunities you're given. That empathy and strength aren't opposites, they're complementary forces that make real leadership possible. Looking back, I'm often asked if I'd do it all again, knowing the risks I took. The answer is yes, without hesitation. Not because of the money or the title, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Letting Celeste steal what I'd earned, destroy what Vivian had built, and hurt the patients who depended on us, that would have been the real failure. Standing up to her cost me sleep, stress, and years of my life. But it gave me something more valuable, proof that the system doesn't always protect the bullies. Sometimes, if you're smart enough and brave enough, you can make it work for justice instead. If you've made it this far in my story, I hope it reminded you that workplace tyranny doesn't have to be endured in silence. Sometimes the tools you need to fight back are already there, buried in contracts or bylaws or policies that nobody bothered to read carefully. And if you found value in hearing about how this played out, consider subscribing to the Payback Office channel. Share these stories with someone who needs to hear that fighting back is possible. Together, we're building a community of 7,000 subscribers who believe that accountability matters and justice is worth fighting for. The scoreboard doesn't always favor the powerful. Sometimes, with the right preparation and a little bit of courage, it favors the people who refuse to give up.